And we are live. Happy Friday. Hard to believe, July already. My name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Safety Foundation. Really happy to be here. Of course, this is the Food Safety Chat Live. And every Friday at this time, 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific, sorry about the people on Pacific, we go live and talk about a food safety topic. And a lot of times it's topics that people suggest. And that's kind of what we're talking about here today as well. So we are live on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So glad everybody is here. And I'm really, really happy to introduce my great friend, Dr. Doug Marshall, the Chief Science Officer at Eurofins North America. How you doing today, Doug?
Fantastic, Bryan. Hope things are well in your neck of the woods because we're not too far away from each other.
Absolutely, yeah. So I, of course, am in Loveland, Colorado, and Doug is just a little bit north of me in Fort Collins. And it's always great having him up in this area. But what's been kind of funny, we were talking before we went live here. Doug and I have been trying to get together for lunch, of course, with COVID and everything else. And Doug has been super busy on that side. Just getting together to catch up over lunch has been extremely challenging. So everybody, please type in, let us know where in the world you're at. I'm always amazed, Doug, where people, so we get Nigeria, Turkey, India, all over the world, people who join us on this live stream. So of course, Jill, our good friend in Minnesota, is here this morning. Jill, really good to see you. Jill's going to be joining us on the live stream here in a couple of weeks. So I'm really excited to have Jill on here as well. So one of the things that we like to do here in the morning as well, Doug, is have everybody join us for a simultaneous sip of your favorite beverage. Of course, mine is coffee. I got my wonderful coffee mug here. And Doug has his water. So please join us, everyone, and take a sip with us. My wife switched me over to a light roast coffee, and good stuff. It's only problem is in the grinder is that you get a lot of that chaff from the outside of the coffee flying everywhere, and it gets static charges and just sticks to everything. So that's always a little bit of a pain. But if there's anything, good morning, Cheryl. Nice to see you. Always good to see Cheryl here. One of the things that always amazes me about Dr. Marshall is his depth of micro, and his knowledge in this area is just amazing. I started off my career as a microbiologist, so we always love to talk shop. But I think you've probably forgotten more in your career than I learned over the course of it. So Doug is just an amazing font of knowledge in this area, and an expert, as anybody who's been to any conferences knows. He speaks a lot at conferences on these particular topics. So we're really happy to have him here today. And Doug, today the topic is kind of an interesting one: ready to eat, and how the market looks at this and all these type of things. So let's kind of talk about it kind of the high level and kind of kick this conversation off. So first off, what is ready to eat? What does that mean?
Well, everybody's been trying to define that term now for the last several years. And I think I'll just leave it to my definition. And if it conflicts with others, apologies. But, we're here to have a conversation on the topic. So let's just get it rocking. So for me, ready to eat, if it's a food or if it's an ingredient, it's being used in an application where there is not a microbial kill step in the process, or the final consumer is not going to apply a kill step in a process to eliminate the microbiological risk associated with the product or the ingredient. And so this becomes challenging. Let's say you're an ingredient manufacturer and you're making a white powdery substance that has some functional properties as an ingredient in maybe all sorts of different kinds of products. And you can use your imagination on what I'm referring to when I say white powdery substance. And, you may have customers that are using this material. Let's say it's in a thickening agent to make a canned soup. So obviously the canning process is a terminal microbial kill step. Does it really matter if you have salmonella, if you have Clostridium botulinum, if you have Listeria monocytogenes in your white powder, if that is the end product that's being manufactured with your ingredient? And I would say the answer is no, it really doesn't matter if you have microbial contaminants in that ingredient for that application. Now then, if you are using it in another product that might have a thermal process or some other sort of kill step, but the product is exposed to the environment after that kill step, and you have potential for cross-contamination.
Mm.
Okay, so again, is that the ingredient manufacturer's issue, or is it the primary manufacturer's issue? So the primary manufacturer might say, yeah, it's a risk. We don't want to have these pathogens on incoming material, even though we have a kill step in our process, because we don't want to get the microbes from the receiving step in the ingredient and come back later in the process and recontaminate product after the kill step. So, you know, in these sorts of scenarios, defining what is ready to eat for an ingredient in this example is really challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it comes down to that application. And really, when FDA was going through and creating the regulations around FSMA, I had the opportunity as part of the team talking with them about foreign supplier verification. That kind of came to mind, Doug, in that we had a long conversation with the team at FDA talking about what you just talked about, which is risk is really not necessarily the material, it's the intended use. So that same white powdery substance can be going in pet food, and that exact same lot could be going in infant formula. And the risk then is tied to that. And it's really incumbent upon that manufacturer to figure that out and control that accordingly.
Yeah, where I've been having a lot of conversations in my realm revolves around an ingredient manufacturer, primarily ingredient manufacturers, but we also have this with, you know, really commodity kinds of manufacturers as well. But the question goes like this: hey, we've been making this ingredient, we've been selling it to this customer for, you know, years and years and years. Customer's been happy with the performance attributes of the ingredient. Now all of a sudden, when they're doing their supplier verification activities, they're asking us, you need to eliminate Clostridium botulinum from this ingredient.
Mm.
And we're scratching our heads because we don't have a process that can achieve that.
Yeah.
And we're questioning why our customer is really asking us to control a microbiological risk that we don't think is very risky, right? Because let's say our product is a dry white powder. You could have Clostridium vegetative cells, you could have Clostridium spores in this powder, but it's not going to do anything, right? You need to consume the toxin to be harmful.
Yeah.
Just consuming vegetative cells and spores generally is not harmful, and we do it every day, right? And we're just fine. And then you start extending the conversation. Well, what is your customer using your white powder for? And do they have a thermal process that heat shocks the spores that makes them more readily able to multiply and grow after their thermal process? Mm-hmm. Are they taking your white powder, hydrating it, so now you've got a water activity that's permissive for Clostridium botulinum growth? And so with ingredient manufacturers, particularly if you're a commodity ingredient manufacturer and your game in life is to sell your white powder cheaper than your competitors, and you may have many different quality grades depending on what the market's willing to buy. And so it becomes very challenging if you are an ingredient supplier in China and you're shipping this product by the boatload all over the world, mm-hmm. to really know what all the intended or unintended use of these ingredients are. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how big of a void there is out there in the marketplace in terms of the primary manufacturer of an ingredient and how that ingredient is being used.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, part of what the food industry does is innovate, right? So they're always coming up with new and creative ways of using these ingredients. And we see these trends with, you know, raw food and these type of things, you know, being more quote unquote natural and these type of things, which is increasing risk. And to your point, these large commodity type materials, the reach is amazing, right? It can go into everything and anything. And so when something happens on that side, it impacts everybody. And from a sampling standpoint, right, if I'm the quality manager at that company making this white powdery substance, and this is something I'm always telling senior management in companies that I'm at, Micro is a very unique thing, right? It's not chemistry, right? Where you can take a sample and it's pretty much going to be the same pH wherever you look if you're doing things right. Micro doesn't work that way, right? To your point, Doug, right? You have clusters of cells and you have different types of things which may or may not grow under certain circumstances. So if you're producing 500,000 pounds of powder in a production day, how in the world do you sample that to even find out what's there? You can't.
Yeah, most of our customers, they'll pull 125-gram sample out of a production lot, and they will have a purchase spec from their customer that says, will only buy this ingredient if it beats an aerobic plate count of less than or equal to 100. So a laboratory performs the assay, it comes up with 101 CFU per gram. And of course, the customer won't accept that lot because it exceeds the purchase specification. Well, number one, that indicator count may or may not have any relevance to food safety.
Right.
And number two, is a count of 101 really any different than a count of 99? And the answer is no.
Right.
And so this is a struggle for a lot of folks in the industry, having to put together product specs and purchase specs. Is what numbers do I choose? It's a little bit easier with pathogens because usually you have a zero tolerance, right?
Right.
But for other micro specs, it becomes a real challenge. How do I determine a spec that I can reliably meet when I'm manufacturing a raw material or an ingredient? And then if I'm a buyer, how do I set a purchase spec that I know my supplier can meet?
Yeah.
And oftentimes food safety has absolutely nothing to do with determining what that number or that spec should be. And I'm often called in to be an unbiased referee in this debate.
Yeah, I mean, because especially on the micro side, if you have very large lots and you have and you look up the statistics associated with this and what you need to sample, it's extremely cost prohibitive. So they're always trying to find ways. Okay, how can we get an idea of how to do this without, to your point, we're producing a commodity without pricing ourselves out of the market, right? So you have these different pressures that these groups are trying to face, and a lot of times on the manufacturing side, to your point, the procurement group goes out and says, okay, well, we need to buy this white powdery substance. Let's find out what's out in the marketplace. And their objectives in the procurement group are different than our objectives in the food safety group. They're going out and finding, all right, does this meet our price point? Do they have the volumes that we need? Can they supply it to us at the rate that we need? And that's what they're being judged on. They're not necessarily being judged on the food safety side. They'll get an example certificate of analysis and give it to the food safety team and say, okay, what do you guys think? And those two groups a lot of time are not aligned.
Yeah. If I could shake the regulatory tree just a little bit here, Brian. Another thing that we often run into is, again, if you're an ingredient or a raw material supplier, you could have many different uses for your products and many different grades for your product to meet those use expectations. But from a regulatory perspective, let's say that you are a manufacturer of little green vegetative particles. Okay. And these little green vegetative particles can be used to provide, let's say, green specks in a salad dressing. Okay. Right? Not really added as a flavoring ingredient. It's just there for visual appeal, to have these little green flecks of some leafy botanical floating in your salad dressing. Salad dressing manufacturer applies some sort of kill step before, releasing the product, so it's microbiologically safe. Now then, these little green specks could also be put in, let's say, a little shaker bottle of a no salt seasoning blend that a consumer is going to be shaking onto their potato salad to give it some sort of flavor profile that they like, right? So again, the material is exactly the same. It's little pieces of green, flaky botanical material, but one is used in a ready-to-eat application. The other one is used in a application where there's a kill step applied by the manufacturer of the actual consumer product. But a regulator, when they're going out and doing, let's say, sampling at the port, and they see, a shipping container full of green leafy substance, they are perhaps presuming that that is going to be destined to a ready-to-eat application and treated as such. Mm. So again, if I'm the salad dressing manufacturer, maybe it's just fine for me to buy salmonella contaminated little green leafy particles, or E. coli contaminated, or Listeria, or whoever, pick your poison, right? Because I'm taking care of it in my process. Whereas the shaker bottle manufacturer absolutely needs to have that green leafy substance as free of pathogens. But our regulators could potentially treat the shipment in a high-risk manner when it's not destined for high-risk use. So that creates unnecessary drama in the marketplace, because the importer and the buyer now is struggling to get that product released for the application they want. And again, I can tell you the price point is going to be very different for that little green leafy particle, right? If you want it pathogen free, it has to be processed, either fumigation, either irradiation, either steam sterilization before it's used. Right. Now that process could occur somewhere at the port of entry, right? It could occur somewhere closer to where it was actually made. Mm-hmm. And so again, a regulator has to make a decision on, has this been processed appropriately for whatever its intended use is? And usually the broker hey, I'm just selling green leafy particles, right?
Right.
Here's my price point. Here's my customer. It meets their purchase specs. What's the problem?
Right. Well, you got to figure too, Doug. I mean, if you're the FDA importation inspection group at the port and these things are showing up, right, and all these things are just coming at you all day long, you have to look at this from a worst case scenario standpoint and say, okay, I can't assume that it's going to the manufacturer with the kill step. I have to assume that it's going to someone who is treating this as ready to eat. Therefore, I need to place a hold on this and do some sampling. And that just bottles everything up. Pardon the pun.
Yeah, it's quite a conundrum. And again, I agree with you that, if you're an inspector, you have to make a boots on the ground decision on what to do with this shipment.
Yeah,
and you're going to use the precautionary principle, mm-hmm. But that really doesn't help commerce. It doesn't help the consumer, because it's unnecessarily driving up prices on things that the risk is being managed somewhere in the supply chain, right?
Yeah.
And it may not be managed by the manufacturer or the importer. It might be managed by the end user. Mm-hmm. And connecting all those dots is obviously a traceability nightmare. So
yeah, well, and the traceability standpoint, I think that's a good point. And this is something that we've talked about on here before. Is FDA is looking at this now at a bigger picture level, and I think this is what we're seeing with the enhanced traceability proposed rule, where they're saying, okay, as a manufacturer, you just can't look at this as, okay, here's kind of like this, right? Here's the things that I buy, and here's what I'm worried about, and here's the next step in the chain, and beyond that, I really don't care. And FDA said, that doesn't really work. You need to really understand the entire supply chain, so that when something's going on, we know who that receiver is, that first receiver responsible for figuring this stuff out. And we can go directly from the end use, the retailer consumer complaint point, back to that manufacturer to start their investigation quickly. And hopefully, that I think that's a good approach. But as we see in the conversations with this, supply chains are exceptionally complicated. And even products within companies, right? You see companies selling things on Amazon and in C stores and standard retailers, and you name it, right? And trying to control that risk associated with that becomes exceptionally complicated.
Yeah. Lest we forget too, kind of the topic of the day is microbiology.
Yeah.
But there are some quality issues at play here too that a regulator is not going to get involved with. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you an example. So if your purchasing department is out there purchasing, let's say I need, 1,800 tons of white powder X with these characteristics, right?
Mhm.
And then you go purchase this lot and you start applying this in your process, and then you get quality failures. And you can sometimes trace those back because what you were buying, you missed one quality attribute that wasn't in your purchase specs. And the classic one that I see with some regularity, and I hate to point on a particular industry, so I'm going to try and be subtle, but so you're buying product A that has been intentionally or unintentionally cut with product B.
Mhm.
Okay, so maybe it's a flow aid, right? If you've got white powder and it's hygroscopic, it's going to clump. So you might be inclined to add a certain percentage of some other substance just as a flow aid. So ideally, you would declare that on the product specs that it's product A with a little bit of product B. But oftentimes that's not clear, right? So that would be intentionally. I don't even want to use the word adulteration. I'll just call it, just an intentional ingredient added.
Mhm.
You could add exactly the same ingredient to exactly the same white powder and not declare it. And now it becomes an adulterant, right? Because the price of the product B is much less than the product A. So let's say this product B is starch. Okay, another white powdery substance that's very inexpensive. And then you start using it in your product, and all of a sudden you have gelation issues, or you have viscosity changes you weren't expecting.
Mhm.
Because your purchasing department got a great deal on this 18,000 ton shipment of white powder. Man, our financials are going to be great this quarter because we've significantly reduced our costs. But unfortunately, now we can't manufacture product anymore because we've got this unintended functional property of this ingredient that we didn't know was an issue until we started making batches of our product, and now we're wondering why our product isn't performing.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think two things that we can follow up on that, right? So the first is design control, right? The process of how you actually develop new products in the marketplace, and then how you involve the manufacturing for the functionality and the processing and the end product, and all these type of things, and then that handoff to the actual manufacturing process where the food safety team now takes a look at it, and you run trials in the plant and things like this. And a lot of times, companies just assume that, white powder is white powder, and we just got a screaming hot deal on this, so it's all good. And you can't do that. You can't do that.
Yeah, companies that operate in silos, and when you've got some very strong personalities, maybe on R&D and maybe on quality, I've had circumstances where, again, I get called in as a referee because the R&D department doesn't trust what quality's doing because quality's just trying to manufacture product, right? And R&D is now questioning the food safety plan that quality developed because they see gaps in the plan. And quality is, they're kind of stuck in their silo. Hey, we've been doing it this way forever. What's the problem? And R&D says the problem is our customers starting to question what we're doing, and we need to defend ourselves.
Interesting. So we've got some comments here. Let's check in on these, Doug. So Tom, thanks for joining us, Tom. Baseline/profile organism of ingredients from common suppliers is key to periodic ingredient checks. Yeah. It will also help identify if a pathogen from the environment or the ingredient is changing. Yep, absolutely. I mean, so part of this too, right, is within your supply chain and in your process is familiarity. So how well do you actually know these suppliers? And as you referenced earlier too, Doug, if you're buying things through brokers, you need to be extra careful. And brokers are starting to become educated on how this process works. And it's this constant reiteration back with the quality team and the procurement group and things like this. And if you're buying these materials through a broker and a hot deal comes up like this, well, okay, fine, we can go through that approval process. But okay, Mr. Broker, we're buying these materials from you from these specific plants at these locations. and you can't send us materials from other locations. I had a recall that happened to me in my past where a broker had substituted materials on me and I didn't know. And they sent it from a facility that wasn't approved, and it was for a non-food grade item. And so that caused us a ton of grief because that product coming into the plant was packaged in exactly the same package. So my receiving team had no way to know. So brokers can really introduce some risk. I think with Fisma in the beginning, right, they weren't, to your point earlier, hey, I'm just selling little green particles. But the community out there that is now the middleman in a lot of these type of transaction and finding good opportunities for company, right? Because we need to make things at a profit. They're really starting to understand their role in this aspect. And I think it's really been reflected too, Doug, and this is kind of off topic as well, but it's interesting how all these things all tie together. Foreign supplier verification. And this is one of the leading things that FDA is writing companies up for, because they don't understand, or they don't have a foreign supplier verification program in place where they know where the product is coming from, what the risk is, and managing through that supply chain and listing this correctly at the Custom and Borders Protection with the right codes and all these type of things so that it gets through smoothly. So these things are all interrelated.
Yeah, I want to reemphasize the point you just made. 483. So the regulatory thumb is starting to come down on these brokers.
Yeah.
And some of the data I've seen is compliance rate still remains quite low. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the short term, and really how serious FDA is going to come down on these brokers. Most don't have any idea what a 483 is and the urgency they need to take to rectify the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key point, so kind of take away a quick little thing here on foreign supplier verification for everybody, is the important thing with this is who's the importer of record? Who owns that material coming into the country? That's what FDA is tracking this on. So if you're buying materials and you're the owner of record, you're responsible, right? And FDA is going to come knocking on your door. And you need to gather the documentation and the food safety data so that you can compile this and understand the risk, because as Doug has been talking about, the risk is based upon the context of how you're using these materials in your application. And you need to be able to explain that to FDA when they start asking questions. So let's see. So Raphael, always awesome to see here, my friend. Raphael always has good comments. So the worst case scenario is always at point of use, more than a shipment at point of expedition. So it's complicated. Imagine cheese made that's sent to a hub and then goes to several states, used in pizza, it's molding when you open it. What's the problem? Was it manufacturing? Was it transportation? Where along that chain? Doors open during transport, due date, right? Complicated, absolutely. And I think a big chunk of this then is looking at that whole supply chain under enhanced traceability, because it's kind of my view, Doug, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is that the guidance documents that FDA is putting out around enhanced traceability and how to get back to the first receiver, and the work that they've done to identify kind of the riskiest type of products that they're most concerned about, that's their starting point, and that really this is going to expand to other products over time.
Yeah, I agree. I hate to be smug about my opinion on what life is like as a regulator. Their motives are good. They know that inheriting supply chain problems is a big deal, because a lot of the foodborne outbreaks, when you do root cause, that is the root cause, is manufacturers are inheriting supply chain issues that they weren't controlling, or they quite honestly had no clue was a concern. But I think the big question out there is, which tool are you going to use to be able to manage your supply chain? A lot of competitors in the space, a lot of technology in the space that is quite good, but if you're a small or a mid-sized manufacturer, do you have the capital to invest in a supply chain traceability off-the-shelf kind of application? Do you try and manage it on your own? So these are all rather substantial questions that I think the industry as a whole needs to resolve. And the players that figure it out, and you're seeing that now, clearly are going to do well.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And I think part of it too, right? And kind of the analogy here I use on this is resource allocation and picking your battles, because the small and the medium-sized companies, as you're referring to, may not have the resources and the capital to do this. But on the other side, they don't really have a whole lot of suppliers. As you get into larger companies, you can literally have thousands of SKUs that you're purchasing within your company spread over a very complex network. And trying to bring in an army of people to manage that is just something that companies can't necessarily manage either. So you need to really look at this. And this is why I pound on this point too, Doug, is you need to look at this from a risk reward standpoint, and your food safety team is really key to that. So back to our topic for today around ready to eat. If your food safety team in your facility identifies and has, we make a ready to eat product. So we are producing, I don't know, like a granola bar or something like this, right? There's no kill steps. There's nothing like this. It's going directly to the consumer and they're eating it, right? We need to have really tight controls around our supply chain, and we need to understand that risk and have some really in-depth conversation with these suppliers. And more importantly too, then, is educating within the company, right? So as we've been talking about, if your quality group and your food safety team are just operating in a bubble, you're setting yourself up for failure. You need to be going out and educating these other groups and say, hey, listen, procurement guys, totally get that these are your objectives and how you're evaluated and how you do your job, and that's fine. But we also need to be involved with what we're doing here relative to food safety, and to your point earlier, Doug, functionality and how these things operate. And just because something shows up cheap, right, there's probably a reason for that. So we need to figure out what that is. And the more the organization understands that nothing happens in the facility until the food safety team approves it, is critical, right? This isn't something that you can do after the fact. You're just really setting yourself up for failure if you do that. And once you've decided that you have a ready-to-eat product, you need to have really, really strong walls around that.
Yeah, I hate to give a self-serving comment, but just for the sake of being transparent, I do work for a testing lab business. But a lot of companies, when they do the risk-reward calculation, they say that testing is expensive. Mm-hmm. Most of the time when I test, I get numbers that are in spec. So it seems like a waste of money. Oh. And where that can come back and bite you if you decide to defund verification activities is what happens when you have an issue. Mm-hmm. What empirical scientific evidence can you rely on to be able to defend yourself when you're having a dispute with your supplier, when you're having a difficult conversation with a regulatory agency, when you have an auditor scratching their head, really questioning whether your food safety plan either has been properly validated or is undergoing routine verification. And this is where these data points become, part of your bank account. Mm-hmm. That and your emergency fund. Most of the time, the data is going to be very complementary to your activities, and so that allows you to sleep well at night. But when you have these issues, what do you rely on to be able to defend yourself? Mm-hmm. And if it's just an opinion, or, well, we've never seen this happen before, shit happens. You can go back into that data set and be able to demonstrate that, yes, we recognize the risk. This is how we're managing that risk. And these data points tell us how well our management plan is working. All of those tell your story. And if it's a compelling story, that allows you to get some relief from some of this burden that might be pressing you. Even if it's not a recall or an outbreak event, you can still have these issues.
Right, absolutely. And like it or not, from a regulatory standpoint, you are guilty until proven innocent, right? So if FDA is coming into your facility and there are reports of consumer illness or things of this nature, you need to have evidence that you can show to FDA that you're doing things properly. If you don't have that evidence, they're going to assume the worst, and you need to prepare for that. So to your point, I love your phrasing on that, Doug, because that's just something I say quite a bit too, is you have to tell your story. There's a reason why you do things, and you need to be able to explain that. Simply putting a procedure in front of an auditor or an investigator from FDA is the wrong way to do things. You need to explain why. And your supply chain is the perfect example of that. It doesn't matter what size your company is, you have limited resources for your supply chain. And within your supply chain, relative to your product, are different tiers of risk for those materials. You need to understand those and have conversations with your suppliers. And then you set up your sampling program to match that risk. So I have this white powdery substance that comes in. Oh, wow, there's been a lot of recalls recently around this substance. I need to remodify that program. I need to have a absolutely locked down supply chain so I understand who I'm getting this from. I need to understand how they're managing risk on their side. And I need to do sampling on my side to make sure that that risk isn't making it through, because I'm making a ready-to-eat product and I'm completely dependent upon those suppliers to help me maintain the safety and integrity of my product. And to Raphael's point, there's lots of points along that supply chain where something can happen. So you need to make sure that the piece that you have and you control is really, really clear, so that if something does happen, you can explain it and work through that issue with the regulatory agencies. And lots of times, Doug, we see this when there's a recall in the marketplace. And then a week or two later, you see another announcement from FDA where they say they've expanded the recall. Right? Well, what that means then is FDA has gone in, began their investigation, and the controls that company had in place were insufficient in some way. So they didn't have good sanitation barriers. They didn't do a good job with supplier control. They didn't understand the risk with their products. And FDA went in and said, nope, you need to recall everything that you made, right? And that's a disaster for a company.
Yeah, I do. Just a couple more points here, Brian. One is when you look at the FDA preamble to the Fisma Law, their justification for rewriting the food safety laws in the U.S. were, number one, too many companies didn't understand the hazards associated with their supply chain or their process. And if you don't understand the hazards, then how do you manage them, right?
Yeah.
And so, that was their number one rationale is we've had HACCP for a long time, but companies just were doing poor hazard analysis and missing risks that they weren't applying appropriate preventive controls for. Mm-hmm. And then to your point also, how do you acquit yourself when you have an inquisitive auditor, inspector, or customer? And I tell folks that I work with that, prove beyond a reasonable doubt that your food safety plan is doing its job.
Yeah.
And that proof comes from the verification data that you have. Verification data does not need to be testing, right? It's all kinds of things that you're doing in terms of your food safety plan. But you need to record those observations and bring those data to life to tell your story.
Exactly. And you're looking at, just like FDA is, you're looking at that in terms of risk. Not all of your materials that you're bringing in need to be evaluated at the same level. So your white powdery substance versus your salt, right? You need to be paying attention to the white powdery substance. The documentation that you're gathering for your salt is going to be a lot less, right? You don't need as much with that. And this gets back to your point, Doug, again, of telling your story. There's a point here, and something that's a personal thing that sticks in my craw, because I think it's something that the food industry really needs to address. And I see this time and time again in food safety plans, Doug, so I'll be curious to get your take on this. Part of the process of putting together a really good food safety plan is understanding what we've been talking about, right? Is what do I make? How is it made? Is it ready to eat? How are the consumers using it? And these type of things. And a big part of that then is, who are you selling to, right? What's your customer base? And time again, when I look at food safety plans for companies, it always says the same thing: general population, right? It's like, really? Are you really selling to the general population? And then you start digging into it and you realize that no, you're not. So let's say, for example, you're doing a novelty dessert that's marketed to children. Is that the general population? No, that is not, right? Is the sales team in your company selling into commissaries at nursing homes or hospitals or things of this nature. Companies aren't paying attention to that. And I think FDA is really going to start calling that out in the future. I'm curious to see what you have to say about that.
Well, I'll use another example. So another white powdery substance that was linked to a couple of foodborne outbreaks in a product that was not manufactured and intended as ready to eat, but a significant portion of the customer base was consuming it as a ready-to-eat product. And the product I'm talking about is cookie dough, and the white powdery substance is flour.
Yes.
And, at the time, if you did a hazard analysis, flour would not have been on your high-risk list of ingredients.
Right.
Who knew, right? But this outbreak, all of a sudden, the light bulb went off, and people started looking for pathogens in flour, and lo and behold, there are pathogens in flour. Yeah. And the manufacturer of the raw cookie dough really never intended people to eat it raw. They wanted, the use instructions on the package says bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for whatever minutes. That's a kill step, no problem, right?
Yeah.
But what happened as a result of these outbreaks was it spawned a completely new product category that never existed, and that is pasteurized flour. Now is a whole new white powdery white substance that's ready to eat in the marketplace, that all of a sudden there had to be innovation that happened to be able to meet a market demand for an application like this, where it really was never intended as ready to eat, but a significant portion of the population was eating it that way.
That's an amazing example, and it's 100% right, because the company came back when this was happening and said, "Hey, listen, the consumers are not following the instructions, and if they do, that kill step happens at that location, right? They bake the cookies." And FDA said, "Nope, you cannot rely on the consumer to make your product safe. It has to be safe going to them," right? And that was a game changer, and it circles back to our conversation on that supplier side. Right. So heat treated flour, expensive, right? It's a very expensive process to do that. And to your point, from a microbiological standpoint, that heat treatment can only take care of so many things too, right? So if you have spores in there and stuff like that, you're probably going to make it. You still need to look at your process and see how that is going to make it through. And and that's why I love microbiology so much. These little organisms are resilient, and they're going to find a way. Right? There was an example a few years ago that absolutely blew my mind, was roasted sunflower seeds that had listeria. And I was just like, how in the world does that happen? Well, after the fact, it came out, it was a cross-contamination issue. They were storing the roasted and the raw nuts close together, and you got some contact going on there, recontaminated the roasted nuts. Absolutely amazing, right? So you need to look at all those things, and you need to understand the marketplace, right? So in this example that you brought up, Doug, everybody eats raw cookie dough, right? We've all been doing it. Your mom would make up a batch and throw in the eggs and whip it all up, and you're sticking your finger in the bowl. Everybody does that. It was something that people knew about, and the food safety team should have thought about that, right? And that's kind of what's hard about these things too, is a lot of this stuff is coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? And when you look at it going backwards, it's obvious, right? So that's why it's always evolving and always changing. And in reality, food safety plans will never be done. And back to the general population example, is you need to be constantly looking at that and saying, how do people actually really use this product? That's going to be how you determine your risk. So let's see here. We got Bruce. Do you think we'll eventually get to the point where we will require a kill step to be implemented for all retail flour?
Good question, Bruce. I'm not going to answer that directly because I don't know, number one, but I'll give you an example that I think is intriguing one to think about. There's a new flour product on the marketplace, and it's called sprouted flour. So this is a product where you take the kernels of grain and you soak them in water at a nice warm temperature, and you allow those kernels of grain to sprout. Now, as a microbiologist, when I cultivate microorganisms in the laboratory, I do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
I take the microbes, I put them in a nice, warm, moist environment with enough food, and they multiply like crazy. Okay. So this sprouted flour then is dried and then ground in, or these seeds that have sprouted then are ground and processed into flour. But there's no kill step involved. So, when I think of sprouted anything, the way you make sprouts is you put the material, the seeds, in a nice, warm, moist environment, and that causes the seeds to sprout. And that also causes microbial population on those seeds to explode. And if you have pathogens there, guess what happens to the pathogen population? And just like sprouts that are ready to eat, right? And we have a long history of that product being incredibly difficult to successfully manufacture and not go out of business because you harm somebody. Now we have this sprouted flour all over the marketplace, and we're expecting the consumer in this case to somehow apply a kill step. So if you're making bread, maybe you've got it. Maybe if you're making gravies, you've got it. But if you're sprinkling it in your breakfast cereal, you don't, right? If you are using it as a release agent making gummy bears, you don't. And then what's the sanitary condition of your kitchen after handling this flour? Perhaps questionable, right? So you have opportunities for cross-contamination all throughout the kitchen. So, Bruce, I don't know if that answers your question, but again, if the consumer wants to buy a pasteurized flour product, as long as Ardent Mills and the like are providing that in the grocery stores and you're willing to pay the extra price for it, then I think that's there. Whether it becomes mandated by regulatory authorities, I don't have a crystal ball to be able to answer that question.
Yeah, that's a strange one. I think it's a really good illustration too of, so we're kind of talking about micro in a generic sense, but in situations like that too, they compete differently, right? And so the reason Listeria came into prominence was because we were able to introduce refrigeration into our supply chain. Listeria is a horrible competitor in the overall environment, and it gets knocked out by these other organisms. Not anymore, right? Because we gave it an advantage in those areas. A lot of times too within industry, we'll do things to deliberately try and knock down the threat of that. So for example, a good example of that is cocoa. So cocoa powder, very, very dirty substance, right? It's got a lot of different points of potential contamination with micro in that supply chain. So a lot of manufacturers, when they are using cocoa making chocolate products, will bloom that chocolate. And to your point in the example, like with flour, they'll prepare a hydrated solution of that cocoa to let the bacteria grow because they want the spores to germinate, because then you can kill them, right? And so putting those type of things into your process, you need to understand that. And that's why people like Dr. Marshall are very helpful in helping you understand these things, because micro, they're tricky. They're very tricky. And there's lots of different ways they can fool us and make it through that supply chain. Let's see. So Bruce had a couple other comments here. Thanks, Bruce. Do you think that the introduction of raw cookie dough that the manufacturers explicitly promote as great or safe to eat raw maybe will contribute to increasing the risk for producers of raw untreated flour? And a follow-up, he said, I think the problem is that consumers don't understand or appreciate the risks. Yeah. So I'll throw in my 2 cents on that too, because part of this too is we have responsibilities as consumers, right? We need to understand our personal risk. If I'm a child, right, I have different risks than a healthy adult with a good immune system versus an elderly person who may have other different risks as well too. You need to understand those things too. And this gets back into my comments relative to the food safety plan and who you're marketing your products to. Because we see this a lot in the marketplace now too, Doug, is marketing where it's like, oh, raw, untreated, natural, with the implication then, right, that it's somehow better for you, and it's implied that it's safer, right? And it's not the case.
Yeah, when I was growing up, we didn't have foodborne illness. And the reason why is because all the fresh produce that we consumed was not fresh. It all came out of a can.
Mm-hmm.
So everything was thermally processed, right? The only fresh things you could get would be fresh bakery goods and fresh meats, right? And so we can get to a point with consumer foods where the risk is extremely small, but the consumer is not going to embrace that form of eating.
Yeah.
Right. And I can take personal responsibility as a consumer. So I'll just use myself as an example. So I am a 60 plus chronic alcoholic. I've got 3 forms of cancer. I'm a heart attack survivor. I drive fast cars with no seatbelt. I act like a 3-year-old, and I'm pregnant. Okay. So when you take my personal circumstances, and if you were my advisor, Bryan, what kind of risk reduction strategies would you say I should do when it comes to my eating behaviors?
Yeah. I mean, you're going to be extremely restricted in what you can eat. You may not like it, but you need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And emerging markets, right? There's these new things now, right? Where we have these pre-packaged meals that you order online, and then they throw in a box all the materials to make it, and they put it on your doorstep. Right?
Yeah, chill chain control is 100% effective in that kind of business model, correct?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Let's see, amazing comments here, guys. Thank you very much. And as you're seeing here too, Doug, I mean, this is a great opportunity to have an expert like you on the line to ask questions. Cheryl, good to see you. When co-packing, how do you determine end use without being too much in your customer's business? Wow. Okay, that's a whole nother topic right there. So for people who don't know on the line and are listening in on this, co-manufacturing is when a company goes outside and contracts with another company to make their product. And my short answer on that, and really this is a whole nother food safety chat is going into this, is you need to have upfront understanding. The best time to get your food safety controls and programs and system in place is before the contract is signed. It gets really, really hard once things are in process, because as a co-manufacturer, they're making lots of products for lots of different people, and your risk is multiplied. But you need to work with them in that context to help put together a robust plan for what you're manufacturing for your products. Because the bottom line, Cheryl, it's at the end of the day, it's your brand and your company that's going to be listed on the recall, not them.
So, Bryan, who owns the food safety plan? Is it the co-packer or is it the brand owner?
That depends, right? Now, it should be the co-packer, right? In almost every situation, in my opinion, right? They have the facility, they understand the risk. They're the ones who are there day in and day out managing risk on your behalf. Now, the complicated piece then, Doug, right, is that let's say, for example, that you are specifying to that co-packer the raw materials that are being used in your product and you're buying them, right? Now, that co-packer needs to push back on you and say, hey, listen, yeah, we're making this for you, but we need full supply chain transparency, and we need this and this and this and this, and we need to understand this, and you can't change suppliers on us for these materials. Otherwise, we need to revise our food safety plan. So that relationship needs to be very close, right? If those two groups are walled off from each other, it's a recipe for failure.
Yeah, oftentimes I see this as another referee opportunity, where the brand owner believes that the co-packer is managing food safety, and they rely on the co-packer for the food safety plan. Then when they get questioned about the food safety plan, they don't understand what's being done in the co-packer, yet they're the ones that have to defend the activities that happen.
Right. If FDA shows up, they're the ones sitting down at the table with FDA. They need to represent you and understand that completely. In the past, I worked for a company where we were co-packing for another company, and they were sending us proprietary mixes of things. And this is really before Fisma started taking off. And they expected us to use this in the process and not tell us what's in it. And we're like, no, absolutely not. we get that this is your proprietary blend. We'll sign whatever confidentiality agreements you need, whatever else, but for food safety, we need to know what's in there. And that was a giant fight at that point in time. So you need to be aware of those type of risks within your supply chain, guys. And wow, look at the time. We've been talking for 55 minutes already, Doug. Let's take some few more questions here. We're getting some amazing questions, guys. Thanks again. Suparna has a question. Inspection of the ingredients before use for correct storage temperature and integrity of the package is also critical to ensure further contamination. Oh, absolutely right. Yeah. If you've got packaging issues, or to our example with the delivery services where they're putting raw materials for your cooking and they don't have enough ice in there or things like this, you're introducing new risk as well. Raphael, in my humble opinion, for consumers, what is missing is education. Yeah, absolutely. So I read that 25% of produced food is wasted due to the due date. Oh, absolutely. My wife, as soon as the expiration date hits, it's in the garbage, which drives me nuts from a micro standpoint.
She always calls me to polish it off, Brian.
I already ate yogurt with a month past the date and it was good. Yeah, absolutely. Who owns the food safety plan? Yep, Raphael, we talked about that. That's a great point. The complexity, right? I mean, so part of this, and I think a good way to kind of bring this back up to the 30,000 foot level, Doug, is there are all these points along the supply chain. We're seeing this in enhanced traceability. All these points in the supply chain that lead to the safe manufacture of food. And like it or not, as people who do the testing and the manufacturing and the supplying and all these type of activities, the consumer has an unwritten expectation that this product is safe, no matter what. In the US market, you can go to the grocery store, buy something, buy a gallon of milk, throw it in the back of your car, let it sit there all day long, take it home, and it's going to be fine, right? And if it's not, and it curdles earlier than the expiration date, they complain, right? That's the world that we're in. We have to try and meet that expectation. And to Raphael's point, a lot of this goes back to education too. And I think really, Doug, that consumers can understand this because if we go to a foreign country where the food safety standards aren't as good as ours, we're cautious, right? We're not drinking the tap water. We're not getting the fresh salad. We're paying attention to what we're eating and focusing our meals in on things that have been treated in some way and trying to minimize that risk. But what's funny is I think every one of us have been in a situation where we didn't follow that rule and then we ended up paying the price. And Montezuma's revenge hits us and we vow to never do that again. So education is absolutely key. Any closing thoughts around that?
Well, I'll go back to, here's another future item for you to contemplate on your chat. And you brought up the home delivery business model, which obviously exploded during the COVID era. But I think the question is who regulates that business model? Because the manufacturers are positioning themselves as retailers.
Ooh.
Okay, so they would be subject to the food code regulations, which is basically times and temperatures, right? Not process controls. And even if they've got a central commissary, if it ships product across state lines,
ooh,
are they now subject to FDA Fisma regulations? And, I think FDA is struggling with this definition as well, with this business model. But here's another scenario that you talked about, and we've had some folks in the chat here say this. Well, you should be able to monitor the temperature during the chill chain. So how many of you have a thermometer that when that box is delivered to your door, you pop it open and you measure product temperature? If we're expecting the consumer to do this, I think that's an unreasonable expectation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think regulatory agencies, as we talked about in the prior examples, are going to push back hard on that. I'm going to say food safety is your responsibility, not your end user. Yeah. Well, I thank you, everybody. Again, I mean, amazing. Doug, we could talk micro all day long. I love this and really appreciate you coming on. You're a super busy guy. And the services you provide in the marketplace are really, really appreciated. So thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian.
Yeah, again, so Doug's email is on here. And of course, Doug is the Chief Science Officer with Eurofins North America. And if you need to reach out to him, please do. And again, next week we'll be back here. And please send in comments and let me know what topics. I mean, there was, within just the course of this conversation today, at least five different topics that we can talk about on future food safety chats. So we'll be back here next Friday at the same time, so 10 a.m. Eastern, to talk about food safety. And really enjoyed having everybody here. Joanne, nice to see you, my friend. And we'll hit this up again. So everyone, enjoy here in the U.S. your 4th of July holiday weekend. It should be a good one here in Colorado. Hopefully Doug and I will be able to get out and enjoy it a little bit. And we'll see you back here next week. So thanks again, Doug. Really appreciate it.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.